Hi there, welcome to my YouTube channel Dhyani classes. If you are watching my video for the first time, do subscribe my channel, hit the bell icon so that you get notified whenever new video will be uploaded. So in today's video we will cover the chapter We Are Not Afraid to Die If We Can Be All Together, written by Gordon Cook and Alan East from class 11 CBSE. So let's get started. So We Are Not Afraid to Die If We Can Be All Together is written by Gordon Cook and Alan East. This lesson talks about the positive attitude and extreme courage shown by the courageous family of the author and the other two men in the face of a storm that had threatened their life and put all of them at risk or endangered their survival. So let's begin with understanding words and expressions from the lesson We Are Not Afraid to Die If We Can Be All Together. So notice these words and expression in the text, infer their meaning from the context. Owning or seafaring skills, that means enhancing or sharpening skills on the sea traveling. Ominous silence, that means unpleasant or scary silence. Pinpricks in the vast ocean, that means search for two small islands in the extensive and wide ocean. A tousled head, that means uncombed hair of the author's son Jonathan. Mayday calls means emergency or life-threatening call. So let's begin with the first paragraph of the lesson. In July 1976, my wife Mary, son Jonathan 6, daughter Suzanne 7, and I set sail from Plymouth, England to duplicate the round-the-world voyage made 200 years earlier by Captain James Cook. So here author is talking about his journey along with his wife Mary and two children named Jonathan and 7 years daughter Suzanne, and they went on a trip by boat from Plymouth, England in July 1976. And further he says he wanted to complete the sea trip around the world that had made 200 years earlier by Captain James Cook. So what do you mean by voyage here? That means a long journey involving travel by sea or in space. And further he says, for the longest time Mary and I, a 37 years old businessman, had dreamt of sailing in the wake of the famous explorer, and for the past 16 years we had spent all our leisure time honing our seafaring skill in British water. So here narrator is saying that when he was 37 years old businessman and his wife Mary had a dream of sailing, that means they wanted to travel by boat around the world in the wake of famous explorer Captain James Cook. So they were very influenced by James Cook's achievement in sailing, and they had been spending about 16 years owning their seafaring skills in British water. That means they had been improving or sharpening their skills on sea traveling in British waters. Our boat Wave Walker, a 23-meter, 30-ton wooden hulled beauty, had been professionally built, and we had spent months fitting it out and testing it in the roughest weather we could find. So here narrator is saying that in order to chase sea traveling record of famous explorer Captain James Cook, they built a boat called Wave Walker, and it was professionally built with supreme design, and it was about 23 meters long and 30-ton heavy weight, and the whole body was made of wood. And further he says we had spent months fitting it out and testing. That means they took several months to test its efficiency and did a lot of examinations and experiments and trials, even the roughest or bad weather, so that they could travel through the sea without any problem. So what do you mean by professionally built? That means the boat named Wave Walker was built in such a good manner that we are unable to find out any mistake in its construction. The first leg of our planned 3-year 150,000 km journey passed pleasantly as we sailed down the west coast of Africa to Cape Town. So here author is saying that the first phase of the sea trip of 3 years long journey of 150,000 kilometers passed very nicely and smoothly, and there was no problem at all while traveling. And further he says as we sailed down the west coast of Africa to Cape Town, that means they reached Cape Town safely and they did not face any challenges until they reached Cape Town. There, before heading east, we took on two crewmen, American Larry Vigil and Swiss House Ziegler, to help us tackle one of the world's roughest seas, the Southern Indian Ocean. So here author is saying that there before heading east we took on two crewmen. That means they hired or added two crewmen before moving towards the east. So what do you mean by crewmen here? That means a group of people who operates a ship or aircraft, etc., and American Larry Vigil and Swiss Herb Sailor to help us tackle one of the world's roughest seas. That means they hired two crewmen named Larry Vigil, and he was from America, and another one from Swiss named Herb Sailor, and they thought both of them would handle bad circumstances or situation during the bad weather or storm in the southern Indian Ocean, which is one of the roughest sea in the world. On our second day out of Cape Town, we began to encounter strong gales. So here he is saying that the journey to Cape Town was very pleasant and smooth, and there was no problem at all. But on the second day, when they started moving out of Cape Town, we began to encounter strong gales. That means they came up against a strong wind. And so what do you mean by strong gales here? That means very strong wind or superstorm. And further he says, for the next few weeks, they blew continuously. That means a storm or heavy wind which was continued for a couple of weeks. While traveling, they were not happy at all just because of strong wind or heavy storm. Gales did not worry me, but the size of the waves was alarming, up to 15 meters, as high as our main mast. So here he is saying that he was not afraid of storm or heavy wind, but the size of the waves was alarming, up to 15 meters. That means he was only scared of seeing the size of waves, and it was up to 15 meters high as our main mast. So what do you mean by mast here? That means mast is a pole that rises vertically from the ship and supports the sails. So as the waves were 15 meters high as mast, so in this way waves made the narrator frightened. December 25th found us 3500 kilometers east of Cape Town. So here he is talking about 25th December, that on December 25th they had traveled 3500 kilometers towards the east of Cape Town, and moreover he says, despite atrocious weather, we had a wonderful holiday complete with a Christmas tree. So despite of atrocious weather, that means despite of terrible and unpleasant weather, they celebrated Christmas Eve together, and they had built a Christmas tree, and they enjoyed each other's company on that day, even they were facing difficulties during the sea journey on the ship. New Year's Day saw no improvement in the weather, but we reasoned that it had to change soon. So here he is saying that New Year Day passed by, but the weather was so terrible and frightening as the previous day of the New Year, but we reasoned that it had to change soon. That means they had hope that the weather would change soon, and it did change for the worse. So that means they were hoping it to change soon, but there was change in the weather, but the weather began to worsen or so bad. At dawn on January 2, the waves were gigantic. So on the early morning of January 2nd, there were huge waves collide with wave walker, and after seeing those gigantic waves, he says, we were sailing with only a small storm jib and were still making 8 knots. That means they were sailing with a small jib. So what do you mean by jib here? That means jib refers to control boat or ship to shift one side to another side. And further he says, we were still making 8 knots. That means despite a storm or huge waves, they were able to manage the speed of the wave walker up to 14 km per hour. As the ship rose to the top of each wave, we could see endless enormous seas rolling towards us, and the screaming of the wind and spray was painful to the ears. So here the ship rose to the top of the each waves. That means as the ship was moving towards the huge waves, we could see endless enormous seas rolling towards us. That means they could see the limitless wide and extensive sea and huge terrifying and frightening waves coming towards them, and the screaming of the wind and spray was painful to the ears. That means the wind comes with huge waves and hit the wave walker, and the noise was too high and loud, and that was the very painful and awful for the ears. And further he says, to slow the boat down, we dropped the storm jib and lashed a heavy mooring rope in a loop across the stern. That means they dropped the storm jib in order to slow down the wave walker and lashed a heavy mooring rope in a loop across the stern. That means they used heavy ropes and tied it tightly around the hard area of the ship or back end of the ship in order to increase the friction of the boat against the water. So what do you mean by storm jib here? Basically, storm chip used in a storm to reduce or slow down the sail sea to maintain or balance the wave walker. Then we double lashed everything, went through our life raft drill, attached lifelines, donned oilskins and life jackets and waited. So here the narrator is saying that then we double lashed everything. That means they tied up everything to save wave walker from approaching danger of rising storm to make sure nothing should be damaged. And further he says, and life raft drill, attached lifelines, donned oilskins and life jackets and waited. That means they took all the precautions and safeguards and they put on their life jackets and oilskins. So life jackets refers to life vest to keep the traveler alive in the water when it comes to an accident while rafting, and donned oilskins refers to waterproof garment. So they put on their oilskin and life jackets with attached heavy ropes, and they just waited to see what will happen next. The first indication of impending disaster came at about 6 p.m. with an ominous silence. So here he is saying that around 6 p.m. the first indication of impending disaster came. That means an unbearable silence rolled over, and that was the first indication of disaster, and then they understood that something bad is going to happen. Further he says the wind dropped and the sky immediately grew dark. So when they got to know that something is going to happen, then wind dropped and then the sky immediately grew dark. That means there was no wind at all, but the sky was darker with heavy clouds. Then came a growling roar and an enormous cloud towered aft of the ship. That means at that time a cloud noise was coming and an enormous cloud towered. That means a huge cloud was coming towards the stern of the ship. With horror, I realized that it was not a cloud but a wave like no other I had ever seen. So here the narrator is saying that he thought that it was just a cloud, but later on he realized that it was a huge wave coming towards them, and said he had never seen such a huge clouds or huge waves in his life before. It appeared perfectly vertical and almost twice the height of the other waves, with a frightful breaking crest. And further he says the waves appeared perfectly vertical. That means it was double the height of the previous waves, and they got frightened, and when they saw a huge wave due to its height, it crashed down on the top of their ship with a frightful noise. Then came a growling roar and an enormous cloud towered aft of the ship. That means at that time a cloud noise was coming and an enormous cloud towered. That means a huge cloud was coming towards the stern of the ship. With horror, I realized that it was not a cloud but a wave like no other I had ever seen. So here the narrator is saying that he thought that it was just a cloud, but later on he realized that it was a huge wave coming towards them, and said he had never seen such a huge clouds or huge waves in his life before. It appeared perfectly vertical and almost twice the height of the other waves, with a frightful breaking crest. And further he says the waves appeared perfectly vertical. That means it was double the height of the previous waves, and they got frightened, and when they saw a huge wave due to its height, it crashed down on the top of their ship with a frightful noise. And further he says the roar increased to a thunder as the stern moved up the face of the wave, and for a moment I thought we might ride over it. So here the narrator is saying that the roar increased to a clap of thunder. That means the sound was too noisy and unbearable, and it was looking like a thunder sound as the stern moved up the face of the wave. That means the back part of the ship started moving up the face of the wave. So what do you mean by stern here? Stern refers to a rear end of the boat. And further he is saying, for a moment I thought we might ride over it. So when he saw a huge wave in front of him, he had a doubt whether he would be able to cross over that huge wave or not. But then a tremendous explosion shook the deck. That means there was a huge explosion in the water, and that shook the entire floor of the ship. A torrent of green and white water broke over the ship. My head smashed into a wheel, and I was aware of flying overboard and sinking below the waves. So here a torrent of green and white water broke over the ship. That means a strong moving stream of green and white water broke over the ship, and my head smashed into the wheel. So due to strong explosion, the narrator's head struck with violent force into the wheel, and whatever belonging they carried themselves flying overboard and sinking below the waves. That means all the objects such as food items, clothes, plastic bags were flying in the waves here and there, and he was thinking that he was sinking in the waves. I accepted my approaching death, and as I was losing consciousness, I felt quite peaceful. So here the narrator is saying that I accepted my approaching death. That means he was sure that he will definitely die because he started losing his consciousness and feeling quite peaceful. So what do you mean by consciousness here? That means a state of being aware of something. Unexpectedly, my head popped out of the water. So further he is saying that suddenly my head popped out of the water. That means his head came out of the water. A few meters away, wave walker was near capsizing, her mast almost horizontal. That means when his head popped out of the water and the wave walker was near capsizing, that means wave walker overturned in the water and her masts were almost horizontal, which means they had fallen. Mast refers to the top right of the ship. Then a wave hurled her upright, my lifeline jerked taut. I grabbed the guardrails and sailed through the air into wave walker's main boom. So here he is saying that then a wave hurled her upright and my lifeline jerked taut. That means the wave threw him with immense force out of the water and his lifeline was stretched, which he was holding to save himself, and then he grabbed the strong fence of the ship, and by the help of the guardrails he was able to move towards the wave walker's main pole. Subsequent waves tossed me around the deck like a rag doll. So here he is saying that the waves were coming on the ship and throw him here and there like a rag doll. That means waves were throwing him like a useless dog. My left ribs cracked, my mouth filled with blood with broken teeth. So here he was injured due to strong force of wave. So he got injured and his left ribs cracked and his mouth was full of blood and he had broken teeth. And further he is saying, somehow I found the wheel, lined up the stern for the next wave and hung on. So later on he found the wheel and lined up the stern and waiting for the next wave to fall on the ship. And further he is saying, somehow I found the wheel, lined up the stern for the next wave and hung on. So later on he found the wheel and lined up the stern and waiting for the next wave to fall on the ship. Now water everywhere. I could feel that the ship had water below, but I dared not abandon the wheel to investigate. So here he is saying that he could see water everywhere and the ship was full of water because of the huge waves. And further he says, I could feel that the ship had water below. That means he could feel water below the ship, but he didn't leave the wheel because he did not dare to go away from there to check what is happening inside the ship. And further he says, suddenly the front hatch was thrown open and Mary appeared. So here there was an opening door and suddenly his wife Mary opened the door and came out and said, we are sinking. She screamed. So she got frightened and screamed that we are sinking. That means we are going to deep end of the sea or deep end of the water. The decks are smashed. We are full of water. Take the wheel. So his wife said that decks are broken and we are in full of water, as she was frightened. And then the narrator handed her the wheel and climbed towards the door to check or investigate what is happening inside the ship and what could be done in order to save the ship from sinking. I shouted as I scrambled for the hatch. So when his wife Mary shouted that we are sinking and the deck is full of water, the narrator struggled hard to move towards the hatch and asked her to take the wheel. Larry and Herb were pumping like a madman. So both the crewmen named Larry and Herb was making effort to throw the water from inside of the ship. They were pumping water like a madman. And further he is saying, broken timber hung at crazy angles, the whole starboard side bulged inwards. So due to huge waves, there were broken timbers, that means broken wooden pieces hanging all the directions, and the whole starboard side bulged inwards. That means right hand side of the ship, everything was upswing towards the inwards because the huge force of the waves came and stick with the deck, and clothes, crockery, charts, tins and toys sloshed about in a deep water. So everything they had in the ship floating, such as clothes, crockery, charts, tins and toys, were roaming around in the deep water. I half swam, half crawled into the children's cabin. So here, as you know, that the cabin was full of water, and he is saying that I half swam. That means he was swimming a little bit towards the children's cabin to know what his children were doing, and said, "Are you all right?" I asked. Yes, they answered from an upper bunk. So he asked his children that, "Are you all right?" And they answered, "Yes, they are all right," and they were sitting an upper bunk, that means upper shelves. "But my head hurts a bit," said Sue, pointing to a big bump above her eyes. So here his daughter pointed to her big bump over her eyes, that means there was a minor injury on her forehead, and said that she got hurt a little bit because of strong force of waves. And further narrator is saying that I had no time to worry about bumped heads. That means he was not really worried about it because it was a small injury on her forehead, because he had to do something urgent to save his family. After finding a hammer, screws and canvas, I struggled back on deck. So here he picked up hammer, screws and canvas and went back on the deck in order to stop water from going inside the ship. With the starboard side bashed open, we were taking water with each wave that broke over us. So here the narrator is saying that there was a major damage on the right side of the boat due to huge explosion of the waves, and the starboard side got broke down. So that's why he took the necessary tools to fix the starboard side. And further he says we were taking water with each wave that broke over us. That means each time waves comes and a lot of water coming inside the boat. If I couldn't make some repair, we would surely sink. So here he was certain that he will surely sink if he couldn't make something to repair that damaged part of the ship to stop water coming in. Otherwise the ship would surely sink. So I hope you liked the video. Let's look at the second part of the chapter in my next video. For more informative videos, do subscribe my channel, hit the bell icon so that I get notified whenever new video will be uploaded. So thank you so much for watching once again. Stay safe, stay healthy.